Hello, 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 and I have returned to civilization once again. I gotta get back, start playing this game and really figure it back out. Had to go back and redo all my controls. Well, I don't think I had to change just the yaw on the cargo bay. I have to go back in there and figure out what all is really mucked up. If I'm using this as a backdrop. It is what it is. Yeah, trust me, station defenses. Alright, so, Afghanistan. What went wrong? I think this is a topic that a lot of people have been talking about as far as that's concerned, and you're going to hear a lot of, CIA, Black Ops bullshit, everything else that's going on back in there. And one of the things that I really want to get into, especially regarding that, is how did things actually look? Moreover, from the perspective of general infantry. Um, I'm trying to play with that just to figure out what I'm going to do with that as far as that's concerned. So, right now there is kind of the idea floating around that the president doesn't necessarily have any real power, that the president is really just kind of a figurehead. Well, I suppose that's true in the case of Biden. But in terms of the actual position as president, the president actually does wield a lot of power, but that's not necessarily where this whole thing went completely sideways. To really understand, at least from the perspective of the guys on the ground and public perspective on why Afghanistan turned into the shit show it was. Um, First thing I want to do is I want to go back into a little bit of a civics lesson. First and foremost, understand that the president is effectively commander in chief. They are, in fact, the supreme commander of the military. If they give an order, that order generally has to be followed. However, the one thing the president cannot do is declare war on somebody. Like, the United States is not a dictatorship. As much as the progressives cry about, oh, we're turning into a dictatorship because presidents, so and so is mean and said mean things on Twitter. Yeah, I know, it's talking about the whole thing. No, we're not. The president generally does not have that kind of power to just randomly declare war on people like a king on a monarchy would, and send the people to go die for a personal cause or whatever it is kings do to declare war these days. I know it's certainly not to take territory and resources like it was in the old days. Well, maybe take resources considering the way people, the blood for no blood for oil. All right, all right. First and foremost, the important thing to understand is that the president cannot declare war. That authority and power lies exclusively with Congress. Now, I believe the intention was to separate those such so that the president could not basically utilize the military the same way that the king utilized the military. Understand that the United States was more or less founded, and the Revolutionary War was part of a greater war that Europe knows as the 100 Years' War. And that's basically when Spain, France, and England were fighting each other for control over the New World. That's a whole topic and video that I'll get into another time. But the founding fathers did not want the president or whoever the supreme leader to have that kind of ultimate authority. They needed to check him somehow, checks and balances. So that's why they kind of divvied up the power there. Yes, the president is supreme commander and has ultimate authority over the military, but he cannot leverage the full might of the military unless war has been declared. And only Congress has that power to ultimately to declare war. They basically have to vote on it, and if majority passes, the United States goes to war. Because of this, the United States of America has technically never had a war since World War II. World War II was effectively the last war that Congress voted to declare war with, And since then, Congress has never voted to declare war since. So all these other wars that we're talking about, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, um, the war on terror right now, the Iraqi War, the Afghanistani War, those are not wars, at least not in the conventional sense. Because Congress did not vote to declare war, um, they basically had to frame it on the official documentation and such as police actions. Uh, so yeah, you have to understand that first and foremost is that because Congress has never declared war since World War II, every conflict the United States has been in since has not been a true war. The president can only leverage so many assets into a given area of operations, or AO. Now, at the end of World War II, we'd gone into Europe, we'd crush Nazi Germany, we broke the back of imperialistic Japan, and everybody was celebrating. At least the civilians were celebrating. Oh, end of the war, everybody's coming home. The generals of that time, Patton especially, looked to Russia, and they saw the expansionist desires of communist Russia, this new Soviet Union. And they said, if we leave that unchecked, we're going to be fighting that next. That communism was the threat at that time. So they basically convinced politicians, the civic leaders of the United States, that we need to start making preemptive preparations to basically fight the Soviets. Now, this is kind of where things start to, where we kind of start getting into why things went so sideways as they did. In order to ensure that kind of readiness, because even at the time, the United States did not have the manpower or technological capabilities to effectively challenge the Soviets if they ever decided to commit to total war. And this was also on top of the dropping of the atom bomb. Now that nuclear power had effectively been taken out of the box, it couldn't go back in, so both the US and the USSR were basically racing to outproduce one another on a nuclear arsenal. Mutually assured destruction, MAD. So, between MAD and a generally weakened military, kind of on both sides, both were suffering from war exhaustion. They needed time to basically rearm, repair, and prepare for an eventual future conflict. The United States came over to Europe. Our allies, Germany, would kind of had to accept the terms of surrender there. But for the other allies that were part of our coalition in that war, we said, hey, to kind of prevent this thing from happening again, we would like to build military bases, American military bases, on your soil. The only thing we ask is that you give us a patch of dirt to bury our dead. And they kind of agreed. And they also kind of, poke each other. It's like, hey, you see that USSR guy? Watch him for us. And if he tries anything funny, we'll come help you. And that's kind of where you're getting NATO and all these other organizations coming from. It's that they were the product of a plan to, if a hot war should ever erupt between the Allies and the Soviet Union, we would be able to win. That was the intent on the East, and because the United States and Europe have such strong historical ties, everything kind of went fairly well as far as that was concerned. Now, the Middle East was a little bit more tricky. That was basically a powder keg into and of itself, and at the time, the U.S. was dependent on foreign oil, and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all the people down there with those oil fields, we needed that oil to maintain the war machine in the event we never needed to go to war with the Soviets. Basically, kind of keeping that ready to go. And we also had our own strategic reserves of oil on U.S. soil. All of this, again, was meant to basically stop the Russians. Or I say Russians, I should probably say Soviets. So, I mean, if you hear me say that, just think Soviet Russia. So, meant to stop the Soviets. All right. So, we needed stability in that region because trade is kind of hard to conduct when you've got a bunch of local tribes basically fighting each other over who is supposed to be the next prophet of Allah when Muhammad died. I know it's kind of funny now, but that was the thing. So we went in there, and we started basically arming the locals to say, hey, get your shit together and focus on Russia. It's like, if you sit here and, fight Russia when the time comes, we'll give you the guns, the money, and the training to do it. And the locals said, okay. Now, mind you, we didn't really understand. This is me kind of extrapolating and assuming something, so I'm probably going to get something wrong here. We didn't really understand, the politics down there of who's who, who's what, and, really kind of understand it. And this is where you get the stories of us basically arming the Taliban and all these other groups down there that basically, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, we armed them to fight the Soviets, and then they turned those guns on us. This is kind of where those stories start. All right, so we basically had the Eastern Front secured against communism, and so now we had to turn around and deal with the Western Front. Now, the United States was basically supposed to kind of watch that, but at the same vein, you've got a pretty significant barrier known as the Pacific Ocean. And of course, one of the great classic blunders. First, never get involved in a land war in Asia. Second, never go as Sicilian when death is on the line. Yes, we're breaking out the Princess Bride here. So, because the whole base building thing went well and the Middle Eastern deals went pretty well, we thought we'd try the same thing out here in the Orient. All the jungle Orient, whatnot, and this is where things start to go a little out of control. So the Soviets started backing a whole bunch of smaller countries out there. You know them as Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, all that little stuff down there. Well, the U.S. saw that, and that's where they were like, okay, our worst fears have been realized. The Soviets are basically going to try to take over the world. We need to spread democracy to stop the spread of communism. Not a republic, like the way the U.S. had been historically founded. Democracy. And by that we mean direct democracy. In other words, the democracy that the progressives are trying to push today is the kind that they were trying to spread back in the 50s and 60s to oppose communism. Are you starting to see a bit of a pattern here about old policies? All right. So the U.S. went into the Orient and basically tried to find out who would be friendly and who could we arm to help us basically fight communism on that end. Well, we started with Korea. Now, for those of you who are thinking, well, wait a minute, what about Vietnam? Well, a little bit of a history lesson for you. We actually had a war earlier than Vietnam, known as the Korean War. And this is also what's known as the Forgotten War. It kind of gets overlooked in favor of the Vietnam War, which was fought, I think, some 2 decades later. And if you are familiar with the book, of which there was a movie on, which had Mel Gibson in it, the book itself is called We Were Soldiers and Young. And there was a movie adaptation, just We Were Soldiers. That was all about the Korean War, not the Vietnam War, as some people would think. Well, again, it was a proxy war fought between expeditionary forces, at least as far as the Soviets and the U.S. was concerned. Congress didn't want to declare war on North Korea. So the president said, all right, we're going to go in as a police action. We're going to sell South Korea all these, all these leftover assets that we have. We're going to teach them how to use it, and we're going to go in and we're going to give them some support. We're going to back them the way the Soviets backed the North Koreans. Well, that didn't quite work out, mostly because that's not. They sent us in. The U.S. Army was sent in with a mission of peacekeeping. That's not what an army is meant to do. And this is where we're going to really dive into the problem on why things have turned out to be a shit show since. The Army's job is not supposed to go in and keep the peace. That's for a specific subset of enforcers known as law enforcement. In this case, the U.S. Army could if they had sent in a bunch of military police or MPs, but they wanted to really put in a display of force to basically stand as kind of a deterrent. Again, that's not what a military is really meant to do. Now, I know some people are going to disagree with me and say, well, if you put in, a large enough force to deter people from attacking, isn't that a deterrent? And yeah, but in the same vein, we were basically putting people there without the expectation of fighting a war. That was the intent when you put in a deterrent. It didn't quite work out that way, and we tried to arm, the locals and teach the locals how to fight against the North Korean army. Well, the locals saw us bringing in all these troops and all these vehicles and decided, yeah, you know what, the Americans got this. They don't need our. They didn't really fight as hard as they should have. They didn't take the initiative the way we wanted them to. It's like, oh, well, the Americans are bringing in all this shit. Well, they've clearly got it. We don't need to worry about it. So they expected us to fight the North Koreans. We expected them to fight the North Koreans because, Congress had effectively handicapped the president, who was working with a fraction of the full force of the military. And also on top of that, both the president and Congress had basically mandated that the military just act as a deterrent. One of the purposes of a military, but not the purpose of the military. So our boys went in to essentially be peacekeepers and instructors and got bogged down in conflict that they weren't meant to be a part of. End result, I don't want to necessarily say this is why the Korean War is so murky. It's not really understand if we lost or won it. Now, if you want to look at it and say, okay, the president and Congress eventually voted to pull U.S. forces out and say that's a condition for loss, then yeah, put it that way, America lost the Korean War. Now, same thing kicks off in Vietnam. We all know how that turned out. And again, it's the same thing, Congress did not vote to declare war, so the president could not leverage the full might of the U.S. Army against North Korea. Korea. See, this is why people tend to get the two confused, and why Vietnam is the more exposed war, and I'm actually going to get into that as well. So, again, Congress did not vote to declare war. The president was handicapped in what he could do, and the president handicapped the army further, saying your only job is to go in there, be a deterrent, and teach the locals how to fend for themselves. And he sends in enough supplies, troops, and whatnot else that the locals were like, the U.S. Army's got this. And it's like, we don't need to fight as hard as we should have. Well, that got dragged out further. And here's why the Vietnam War is the more well-known, more popular, and publicized one. See, the advent and widespread use of the television. This is the primary difference. The Vietnam War was televised. So you've got all these horrors of war being recorded in real time and transmitted across the ocean to your television set in your living room, real time. You were literally right there watching, your family, your soldiers, your everybody else, getting blown up, getting chewed up, spat out, and all the atrocities. So let's be fair, it was not a clean conflict. That kind of gave rise to the whole, soldiers are baby eaters concepts and whatnot else. It was basically, you heard all these things about PTSD, trauma, Shama, all these things these soldiers suffer over there when they're fighting in foreign lands, and you see none of it. Well, the Vietnam War brought all that home, and it inflicted that exact same trauma on the American citizens. And since then, the American people as a whole, and Congress and the president and everybody else, they've pretty much lost the stomach for war. And this goes a little bit further into the whole thing. When the Vietnam veterans came home from this war, that they kind of lost big time because they were basically handicapped and couldn't do what an army was meant to do. They came home demoralized, dejected, and whatnot, and instead of being given a hero's welcome like you see today, they were treated like absolute dog shit. That's the sad part, the true sad part about the Vietnam War. The boys were broken, morale was down, we effectively lost the war, we got humiliated, kicked out of the country and all that fun stuff, and we basically come home to people just using and just abusing the shit out of us. And it basically took a Herculean effort by a bunch of dedicated individuals to turn the whole thing around so that these Vietnam vets could get the help they need as far as drug dependency, treatment for PTSD, and just general reacceptance by the American people. In contrast, World War II, the boys were tired, they were exhausted, morale was down, even though they'd kind of won a war. They wanted nothing more than just to go home and hold their loved ones. And when they came home to a hero's welcome. People were coming back, oh, thank you, brave American soldiers, appreciation everywhere, and, all the veterans were celebrated, and, it was night and day compared to the Vietnam War. And I would like to think that if it wasn't televised, if the Vietnam War had not been televised and it had been told the way it had been through radio and newspaper, a bit of a delay between there, if the horrors had not been home, I would like to think that the American public, as unpopular as the Vietnam War was, they would have embraced the soldiers coming home and say, look, you were given a shit job, we understand, you did your best, and we're just grateful you're home. But because everything had been televised and sent back to the States in the way it was, they weren't as accepted in a loss as they should have been. And we like to think of the movie Rambo as kind of as an action movie. Well, the truth is that when Rambo, when it first came out, it was basically part of that Herculean effort to get the people to reaccept those poor vets who desperately needed, the love and support of their citizens and didn't get it. Rambo was kind of meant to really showcase the struggle in a way that, the average person could understand. Nowadays, it's just touted as a dumb action movie. But when you go back and watch the first one, think of it in this light. What it's trying to, the message it's trying to get across is, respect the soldier. Respect what they do. And even if they lose the war, the best thing that you need to do is you need to be there for them when they start having these when they start trying to go through the process of just comprehending what they've seen. But we're kind of getting lost to it. All right, so morale was down, trust in the military was broken, and the military wasn't being used for its intended purpose, and that's why they lost. And we're going to get into it now, because one of the more recent conflicts in history, again, not a true war, but a conflict nonetheless, was the Gulf War, otherwise known as the 100 Hours War. Now, unlike the various conflicts of the past, where we were sent in as a police action and basically hamstrung, where we were meant to sit there as a deterrent force and not actually go fight, the Gulf War was an entirely different beast. You had the Iraqi army basically menacing our allies, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all that fun stuff down there, and basically threatening the oil pipeline. And I think this is where the narrative comes in, no blood for oil and all that fun stuff. But our allies had asked for help. Gondor calls for aid. Rohan will answer. The United States showed up, and even though it was still a punitive force, again, we still never voted to declare war on Iraq. The president, instead of saying, all right, you're going to sit here, you're going to be a deterrent force, and you're going to let the locals go hash this out instead, the president, no. What happened instead was the president said, there's the enemy, go kick their faces in. This is what a military is meant for. This is what they were meant to do. This is what the U.S. Army and the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy all train for. You point us at an enemy and turn us loose. And you tell us, don't stop until they surrender. We are good at that. That is what the military has trained for. That's its intended purpose. It's not to sit around and babysit people all day. That's the job of law enforcement, and that's a whole different discipline. The Army is trained to bull rush the enemy, knock him down, and beat him to death with your helmet if that's what it takes to kill him. It's a very different mindset from law enforcement. That's what we trained for, and the 100 Hours War showed how successful the military is when it is fulfilling its primary objective in that regard. That's why we call it the 100 Hours War. We ripped through the Iraqi army so fast because we had a target to kill and orders to kill it, no holds barred, that we just obliterated them in 100 hours. This was a game changer, considering what had happened in the Vietnam War, where we were told to sit around and just babysit everybody and fight the enemy if they came to hit us. And that's kind of where the whole Tet Offensive came from. The United States was trying to fight a defensive war that wasn't really a war. The North Vietnamese, however, well, they were treating it like it was actual war. And whew. So, two different mindsets when you really think about it. What the Vietnam War was, and the difference between that and the 100 Hours War of the Gulf War. That two entirely different mindsets, and that's why the Gulf War is considered so successful, and that is basically considered the modern baseline on why everybody talks about the United States military as being the most powerful in the world. Because when you pull shit like that off, and it's been a good, 20 years since you've been at war, yeah, that's going to set a new benchmark. And to be honest, the military needed something desperately to kind of recoup its, recoup public trust in it, as well as the morale after the abject failure that was the whole Vietnam War. It's the War of 1812 all over again. And just kind of as a side tension on that one, the nascent United States, after a successful Revolutionary War, decided to look at Canada and say, you know what? We're going to kick out all European influence, so we're going to go run the Canadians out of Canada. And as I'm pretty sure any Canadian will probably sit here and laugh about, is that, well, when the U.S., the young innocent America had eyes bigger than its stomach, and the Canadians were laughing at our attempts to run them out of Canada all the way to the White House, which they torched. And to be honest, it had kind of the same effect as the whole Vietnam era war actually did. Like, the Vietnam War wasn't the second war that we effectively lost because of how poorly mismanaged the war was. Like, the Canadians like to rub it in the Americans' faces about the War of 1812. Trust me, if there was a round two, it'd probably go much different. But the reason why the War of 1812 is so blank in terms of the U.S. stuff is not necessarily because, we've forgotten the sacking of the burning of the White House. It has to do more with the fact that, that definitely broke U.S. Army morale, and they kind of had to go back to the drawing board and realize we did not have the Navy or logistics to kind of do that whole counter in there. But here's the real rub on why the War of 1812 isn't as any real significance to Americans. The Battle of New Orleans. Basically, General Andrew Jackson, yes, the same president, the same man who later became president, did not receive the ceasefire and stand down order to stop fighting the Canadians when he basically launched into the Battle of New Orleans. And he basically kicked the Canadian army up and down the Mississippi at the Battle of New Orleans so thoroughly that it basically restored morale in American soldiers. It's like saying, wait a minute, we can fight this, we can win. And then after Andrew Jackson basically got a victory over the invading Canadian forces and basically mercilessly kicked the crap out of them so hard that, they surrendered. And when they surrendered, that's when Andrew Jackson got the order from the actual Congress and Generality that said stand down. So because the ceasefire order came late, made a whole bunch of difference in the terms of the War of 1812. If that ceasefire order had arrived on time before the Battle of New Orleans, we would have been facing the Vietnam War before the Vietnam War. The outcome of that war would have been the same thing. We would have sit there broken, dejected, demoralized, and the nation probably would have crumbled before it even began. As it stands, because of the Battle of New Orleans, the whole thing, Canadians will celebrate it as this great victory against an innocent United States, and they'll rub it in our faces to this day. To Americans, the War of 1812 battle against Canada was a draw. They got it. They had us in the first half. We got them in the latter half. And it was because of that the United States even managed to hold together and reevaluate, how it conducts war. We learned from that. And that's why why the Civil War was one of the most bloodiest conflicts in American history, is because, the United States as a whole learned from the War of 1812. And when we use that against each other, to this day, no conflict the U.S. has been involved in has the number of dead Americans that the Civil War does. And we also took those lessons further when we got involved in World War I and World War II. We had an enemy to fight. We learned the lessons from the War of 1812 about logistics. And even though it had been a hot minute since we'd been to war, we were basically able to grit our teeth and grind our way into Europe both times, as well as grind our way into Japan on World War II. And I guess those victories kind of went to our head. All right, I've rambled on about history, and you're probably wondering, well, what the fuck does any of this have to do with Afghanistan? It has everything to do with Afghanistan and why everything happened in the first place. When the War on Terror kicked off, they were probably thinking we were going to get another Gulf War. Didn't happen. Instead, we got another Vietnam War. Ironically, it lasted almost the same length. Again, what happened is you took the most powerful military in the world, plopped them down on a sand dune in the Middle East, and said, all right, you're going to sit here and do nothing. You're going to sit here and basically be a deterrent. Your job is to basically sit here and glare at anybody who looks at you funny and even thinks about committing more terrorism against the United States. And this is where other channels will talk about it, and they'll say, we didn't handle our business, go in and kick the crap out of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and all these other groups the way we should have. Because that's where the story basically comes back to bite us. We armed the people in the Middle East to stand against Russia. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's like, well, who do we fight now? You know what? I don't like the look of that United States. They're getting a little uppity and becoming a nuisance because they're being the world police. Let's go kick them out of our country. So that's where that whole thing came from. And so instead of being sent in and told to just go, look, here are the motherfuckers you need to go kill them to the last, and pursue them to the ends of the earth if you have to. That was not the order that was given with Operation Enduring Clusterfuck. No. It was being told basically, go in, play nice with the locals, and do whatever you need to do. So now this is where all of the sorts of channels will come in and they'll tell you, oh, this was all CIA intelligence operations to, get, to basically reestablish the petrodollar and to take the resources, the land, and all that other stuff. And, we were infringing on their human rights violations and all that fun stuff. No, that's not what I'll leave that to the other channels. What I will tell you is what the general infantry was told and what their mission was. It was basically to go in and be peacekeepers, which, as we've established, a military is not to be used for. We're not good at peacekeeping. Totally different mindset from what a military, from an army's intended use. Now, our enemies, the insurgents, they were under no illusions that they were conducting war. And so they were conducting war. So, that's the thing. When you have one side that acknowledges a war for what it is, and it fights as if it is, it fights as if the conflict is a war, you're going to get the outcome that you had with Korea, with Vietnam, and with Afghanistan. Versus another side which doesn't seem to recognize that it is at war. At least the soldiers on the ground knew it was a war. And you ask any of the boys that were on the ground in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they'll tell you, yeah, it was totally, the conditions we were down there fighting in were war. But from a policy aspect, from the cathedral that we've talked so much about, it wasn't a war. It was never meant to be a war. They couldn't label it as such. They could not effectively declare war. And because of that, they kind of hamstrung the soldiers in what they could and could not do. And, well, that's why Afghanistan is the way it is. Now, for those of you who may have noticed the pattern, I'll go ahead and spell it out for you as far as this is concerned. We are operating from a position of feeling like we are the ultimate power in the world. And frankly, the Gulf War has been kind of a much-needed buoyancy for that one. Everybody points to the Gulf War and says this is why the United States cannot be beaten in a direct conflict. Now, I won't dispute too much of this, but in the same vein, you also have to understand that the mentality for the Gulf War was vastly different compared to the Korean, Vietnam, and Afghani War that we're just now getting out of. Again, those three wars we were sent in with the mission of being peacekeepers, which is not what a military is meant to do. The Gulf War was an entirely different beast. We were sent in to kick the shit out of some motherfuckers, and we did that very, very successfully. So, why is it that the policies are the way they are? This, again, goes back to the doctrine that was put in place by military generals to basically contain Soviet Russia. And this is generally why you see the progressives, the Democrats, the left go on about Russia, 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 Russia. They're still operating on these Cold War policies. And, this is something, that the individualists on the non-left are basically looking at it and go, why are you still operating like it's 1960s Cold War era? Like, why are we still on these policies? And this is where a lot of the people who are fans of Trump like what he did, is that he wanted to effectively sit down and renegotiate. It's like he said, okay, Trump like rightly points out, okay, Cold War is over. We don't need to be fighting this way anymore. We need to reset the board and rethink how we do things in this new postmodern era. Well, that basically meant taking a lot of power away from a whole bunch of individuals. And that's why I think the Democratic elite are fighting so hard to try and remain power, because the policies that they have been operating under and living under stem from direct democracy, and that's what the order of the day was to defeat communism. So that there's that. Because, the USSR it's gone. It's gone. We don't need these policies in place anymore. They're hurting us more than they're helping us. They were necessary back when we faced the threat of the Cold War, but now that the threat is, gone, we don't need those policies anymore. And it's because of that, they're still trying to operate on those policies. And I think that's what a lot of the critics of the left and the Democrats are trying to say. It's like, guys, you're outdated. You're operating on policies that don't make any sense now. Come on, new deal. Let's deal a new hand. Let's figure out where we're going from here. And I think that's where a lot of the apathy and issues that are plaguing the United States are coming in now. We've beaten the Great Threat. 1989. November 10th, 1989, the end of the era. 1990, dawn of a new era. Well, where do we go from here? I don't think we've really answered that question. We've just been continuing to operate, as if Soviet Russia is still kind of looming over the horizon. And mainly so that the people who are currently in power, and have been in power since 1950, 1960, want to keep it that way. And another little tidbit that I want to talk about while I'm kind of thinking on this one, and just real quick here, because it looks like I'm kind of hitting that hour-long cap. This whole rise in consumerism, you got to think, we couldn't, afford to start a hot war with the Soviets because of mutually assured destruction. Matt couldn't, nuclear World War III. That was the fear. So, how do you beat an ideology that you can't win in a hot war? You can't outfight them. What do? You outspend them. Yes. See, we didn't beat the Soviets through force of means. We outmoneyed them to death. We outspent them to death. All those frivolous projects that, we talk about, TK and I had a very interesting conversation, and TK is basically sitting there telling me, how all these ridiculous engineering projects were like, it's a bloody miracle any of these even worked. But they did, and that's what makes them so fascinating and astounding to me, and I wish we could do more of them. Was because most of those projects were basically designed to spend the Soviets into submission, and we succeeded. The collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't because, we beat them into submission through force of arms. They went broke. The Soviet Union collapsed because it went broke and couldn't afford to basically keep pace with the United States anymore. It wasn't just the whole race to the moon. The whole USSR rivalry extended even further than just the conflicts and race to the moon. It was also economic power. The Olympics. I remember there was a movie, Miracle. It was about the United States hockey team going up against the Soviets. I think in one iteration of the Olympics, and how they won that hockey game against arguably the best hockey team in the world. The NFL, they sent the NFL All-Stars to go up against the Soviets, and the Soviets wiped the floor with them because of the idea that, hey, if we put together a bunch of, all-star players to put in there, they'll win. But the problem is that when you do something like that one, see, this is what I talked about in one of the last videos, where the individualist is at a disadvantage, because that's what all-stars are. When you put together an all-star team like that one, you've got basically a bunch of individualists who all think they know how to play the game the best way, conflict with each other. And that's what the coach didn't want for his team. And the movie is all about basically breaking down these college-age boys as opposed to the 40-something, 30, 40-something NFL players who've been at the game for a while. Basically taking a bunch of young men who don't have that mentality of, I am the best, I am the bread maker for the team, coming together and creating a team out of it. He didn't come at them with a bunch of all-star individuals. He came at them with a unified, cohesive team. And when it was team to team, the young college-age hockey players outdid their 40-something-year-old Russians who had been, again, communism is a collectivist ideal. So when you're going up against a sports team like that one who believes in the collective ideal and you're coming at it with individuals, foregone conclusion why the Russian team was considered the best in the world until it went up against these young Americans who, as the coach puts it, you don't defend against them. You attack them. You beat them at their own game. You take their own game and you shove it right back in their faces. And he won. Okay, where was I? I kind of got lost of right. Consumerism. Right. So that was the whole order of the day. And, while the military is sitting there staring at the Soviets, waiting for this hot war to pop off and getting their asses kicked, in Korea and Vietnam and all these other places in there, the consumers were at home spending like there was no tomorrow. They spent money, they made money. The GDP grew because of productivity and spending. And because, I know it's kind of a misnomer to say, because we valued truth and honesty over, the needs for the individual over the needs of the state. And this is why the Soviet Union collapsed and why China, in a protracted trade war with the United States of America, is collapsing. Is because they're lending out money recklessly. And when the state comes in to say, all right, where's all of our money? And the bookkeeper is looking at his books and suddenly realizing there's no more money in the treasury at all because they loaned it out to everybody to start all these businesses to compete with the Western culture. They're frantically slamming the book shut and say, nope, nope, everything's fine, everything's fine. We're making more money than we ever have been because it is in his self-interest to lie to his masters and say we're in the black when they are so deep in the red that they can't even afford to keep the lights on. Because otherwise it's going to be his head on the chopping block. I know that's kind of a kind of an whole ironic thing considering today's policies of lies and slander, but we're still kind of feeling that today. I know one thing that Tom likes to talk about is how we have effectively become a nation of consumers, because that was the policy that we operated on for the entirety of the Cold War. Like almost 30 years of rampant consumerism, because that's how we beat the Soviets. And now that it's the end of the era and we need to figure out where we're going next, we haven't really figured it out. And so we're still operating on these ineffective policies of old. And that's also, again, why Afghanistan is the shit show that it is. Because we were basically operating on these ineffective policies. All right, one last thing before I do this, because it looks like I'm approaching the hour. So this will be like the longest video I've ever done. So why is it that these policy leaders, these politicians, can't make good policy? Well, it's an interesting lampshade that I'm going to point out here as far as cultural goes. There's a line in Back to the Future, if you all remember. Marty McFly goes to a younger Doc Brown because he's stuck in the past, and he mentions that the president is Ronald Reagan, and Doc Brown is like, the actor? And then Marty shows him the camera. They wire it up to the Doc's TV because I think VCRs hadn't quite been invented back in the 60s, which is where Marty was trapped because the movie takes place in the 80s. So the cassette tape was like a foreign thing, so they'd kind of wire it up to the TV. And Doc kind of looks at the whole thing, and he's like fascinated. He's like, "Oh, no wonder your president's an actor. He must have to look good for these cameras." And while it is kind of meant to be a bit of a joke, look back at history. Some of the greatest presidents that are considered to be the popular greats were generals and intellectuals. And let's not get intellectuals confused with the modern academics. I'd point out a meme here where you got like an 1800s school marm sitting at it's a comic that's out there. I can't remember the full name of it here, but I can describe it, and someone can probably find it. You've got on one side of the panel, you've got a 1800s school marm sitting there at her desk, all prim proper and just being authoritative, because back then, teachers were considered the ultimate authority in their classrooms. And then you've got a kid, like an 1800s kid, spinning beanie cap and lollipop in his hand, cowering as his parents are standing between him and the teacher with a piece of paper with an F on it, just kind of snarling, growling, and raging at him. And I'm not going to tell you the caption yet because it flips the side of this. So that's the left side of the comic. The right side is the complete opposite. You've got a modern school teacher just sitting there cowering in front of these snarling, growling parents in her big puffy sweater. And the kid is just standing there at the side with a menacing grin on his face. And, the parents are holding the same piece of paper with an F on it, and they're facing the school teacher. And the caption for both parents is the exact same, so it's just one speech bubble. Care to explain these grades? And the picture, the cartoon is basically pointing out how authority has transferred from the school teacher to the student. Which is, unprecedented for the intellectuals of early America. they grew up in a time where if you disagreed with the teacher, if you did not perform well in school, your parents were going to beat your fucking ass. Not so in the modern era where kids are basically catered to and teachers are always under fire and the kid can do no wrong and all that fun stuff. So, modern academics are not the same as intellectuals. I think we should make that distinction. But yeah, just want to touch on that real quick. Look at the last few look at the very first presidents. You have intellectuals and generals, people who know how to conduct war and how to operate, as diplomats. Compare this to modern, the presidents and civics leaders of today. They're actors, career politicians, and celebrities. And these people don't quite understand how to direct a military the way it's meant to be directed. They don't have the balls for it. And it doesn't help that the public doesn't have the stomach for war like it used to. Like, you got all these kids march around in the streets these days, all these activists screaming about, oh, we can't wait to, start open war against, the alt-right and all the fun stuff. And, we're going to shoot them all dead. We're going to stick them in concentration camps and we're going to exact all these horrible tortures and whatnot. Oh, the folly of youth. And I say this because, they don't know what war truly is. We've been so war and conflict averse that these kids don't know what they're in for. So that's my take on why we lost the Vietnam War. Why the Afghan War was just a fucking shit show. I kind of know we kind of went all over the place, but I felt it was important out of historical context to bring all this up so you understand, that unless we change policies, this is just going to keep continuing. Or maybe I'm just screaming into the void on this and nobody is paying attention.